This is a tricky one. Today, we are gonna do the coolest time lapse. Like imagine, you're moving on a motion time lapse, 6 months in the making, in onto a barn. And it looks something like this. And then you look at the footage and you're like, that's terrible. How am I gonna do anything out of that? So you run warp stabilizer and you're like, then it looks like this. Wow, that is even worse than what I started. And then you don't know what to do. So you're like, hey, I should probably send this to somebody who does motion time lapse all the time. I know, Rob Nelson. Actually, it is kind of tricky. It's gonna involve 2 things, and we're gonna go through both of them in depth today. Motion tracking, a little more advanced than just throwing warp stabilizer on it. And then we're gonna have to figure out how to deal with this flicker, because every single day, like look at this, every day, totally different exposure, and it's just going to be really difficult for the eyes. In fact, here, let me just show you. This is the unflickered version. And we're going to be able to adjust this just slightly. We're going to put a little bit of deflicker onto it. It's going to look like this. So there's some things that we can do to this time lapse. We're using things that we know how to do in other forms of time lapse photography. We're gonna try to apply it to this really neat barn time lapse that was done over the course of several months. All right, let's start on the computer. These are some of the original images that I got here. You can see there's this beautiful barn and you got this big field. And obviously it was taken over slightly different periods of time, because all of a sudden, look, here's somebody's plowing the field. Well, this one's foggy and out of focus. I don't even know what happened right there. And then you got long shadows and really bright grass right here. And the crazy thing about all of this is every single one has different exposure. And if you look really detailed on the barn, like as we're moving in, the barn is more or less staying in relation to those trees where it's supposed to, but the elevation is changing just a little bit. Oh my gosh, this one is raining. This picture is like literally raining. You can see the rain coming down. I mean, we got a lot of things to deal with this particular time lapse. You know, I want to, as we go through this, for you to think about, well, one, yeah, let's follow along with what Rob's doing here. Let's know what buttons to push to make this one happen. But in reality, if you go out and do your own, you have to do a couple of things. First, think about how to shoot it, and then think about how you might process it. And both are going to be slightly different. So let's start with the first thing. You know, I suppose if you were to go out and redo this, one of the things you might think is, let's try to get at least the same lighting throughout the day. I might even pick one where the noon sun is as high as possible, straight up and down. So you don't have these shadows that flicker this way and that way. Because, you know, for this image to this image, for instance, those shadows, those are a big kind of disconcerting thing going back and forth. I like that he got the balloon in the background of this one. And this is cool. Look at this, the helicopter over here. You see that? Freaking helicopter in this shot and a balloon. Man, I don't even know what they do out here at this barn. It's very cool. I want to do this. This is cool. Some of these images, like the barn is blown out. Now it's like decently exposed. Now it's a little fuzzy. Now it's sharper again. Oh, maybe those were 2 images that he took. Maybe I'm only supposed to take one of those. I'm just flipping through all of them. There's kind of a nighttime shot. I think the ideal is if you could go out when there was no sun on multiple days throughout the course of a year, that would be ideal. Take it when it's slightly overcast. You don't need to get all of the different conditions. Don't worry about the bright sun. The bright sun's going to cause all these shadows and it's going to make the tracking more difficult. So if you could choose, like this one, what am I supposed to do with this? Everything's in shadow. That's tricky. Don't get me wrong, we'll make it work. The other thing you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna fly it along the same path. Obviously, this is the path. Look, we've got a path that goes in towards the barn and then it kind of circles around the barn, around to the backside. I kind of like the way that drone shot worked. The problem is when you're tracking, this is essentially a hyperlapse. Usually what you wanna do with a hyperlapse is you wanna put one thing as your central focus closer towards the center of your frame, and you want to push in on it or pan by it, right? That's how you do hyperlapses. And that allows your tracking software to track one particular piece of that frame. And in this case, the barn is that central piece. And as we go by here, we're going to find something on the barn to track. On this simple orbit, that seems to work. As you're going around, I think we could make that work. But if you go all the way to the beginning of this image, what you'll notice is that the barn is all the way off to the right-hand side of the frame, which it actually makes it somewhat difficult because as you push in, you're actually kind of like pushing sideways on the central focus of your whole image. So I would have actually framed up the barn in the center. and then panned in it or out of it. One basic motion is what I would have done. But here we have kind of two motions, like a push in and a pan over. And then also on top of that, you have an orbit. So there's a lot of things that are going on here, and it makes it difficult because 121 images isn't even 5 seconds. If you were to do 24 frames per second, then you got about 5 seconds. Yeah, that makes sense. But that's a very short time lapse. And so in reality, we might actually want to double frames up a little bit, make it move a little bit slower, or try to blur in between frames. We'll see what we were going to do here. But the first thing that you're going to do, I don't know how to do it any other way than through After Effects. After Effects really is the key to doing these cool moving time lapses and trying to track the footage. It is the ultimate at that. As you can see, I have lots of barn time lapses that I've done. Let's create a new one. From the very beginning, new barn time lapse. Now you've got a couple different things. You got your composition window over here, you got your project window down here, you've got your timeline down here. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take our Finder, and I went ahead and I deleted a few different pictures. Actually, let's go through this one. Let's double it up again. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna go through this thing pretty quickly and figure out where there's some frames that I need to delete, because there are definitely a few that seem to be redundant. You can do this process later, but I like to do it beforehand because it saves you some hassle. Well, that one lined up perfectly. I don't know what he did here, but this one lined up perfectly. Okay, that gives us enough to work with. Now I'm just going to take that whole folder and I'm going to drag it over into my project. Now what that does automatically, this is great in the Creative Cloud 2018, it creates all of them right there. Now I can just drag that over onto a new composition. And here's my composition. It's quite a large composition because it's taking the raw files. And ta-da! There you have it. Now let me just show you what happens if you just run Warp Stabilizer. Check this out. Pop on Warp Stabilizer, it's gonna run in the background, render as needed. It's got 120 frames it's gonna go through, and it looks like this. I've had way too much caffeine today. Oh, whoa! As you can see, yeah, fudge balls. And I can see, this is why he sent this to me. He ran Warp Stabilizer, he followed one of my other tutorials. And if you can tell, it's like, whoa, you're watching this and you're like, what the hell is happening? Yeah, there's like nothing you can do with that. You're like, I could see, you'd look at that and you'd be like, oh my gosh, that is terrible. Okay, well I can tell you right now, there's a good reason Warp Stabilizer didn't work. Warp Stabilizer is taking your entire frame and trying to figure out what to lock onto. You know, you've got the barn here, and then you got the barn there, and it's shadow here, and mountains here, and clouds, and then no clouds, and it has nothing to lock onto. So of course it's lost, so you gotta tell it what to lock onto. And to do that, you're actually using a slightly different thing than Warp Stabilizer. You can use Warp Stabilizer at the very, very end. Okay, let's stop. All right, let's delete Warp Stabilizer. Done, it's deleted. Okay, what we're actually gonna do is we're gonna lock on to this window right there, and we're gonna do a simple track motion. Now we're gonna start with just one tracker, and we're gonna do just position. Okay, so here's my track point. Now I wanna show you a couple things about tracking. This is the search area, the bigger outer square, and then the inner square is what you want to actually search for. And then the little triangle is what you want to lock onto. So if you're gonna lock something onto it, it's gonna lock onto that little bit. So anyways, let's take this over here. What we want, we're gonna zoom in just a little bit. We actually wanna maybe track this window, and I'm gonna put the tracker up in the upper right-hand part of that window. Okay. Now, down here in the tracking options, I don't feel like I really need to go through all the details of this, but let me just show you what we have. As far as options go, this is our single one tracker, or there's a few different ways you can track. One based on differences in color, one based on differences in your luminosity, so light and dark, and then one on your saturation. This one could be luminosity or RGB. We'll just go with RGB. We'll probably want to enhance this before the match, and then we want to do sub-pixel positioning, which is going to allow you to basically find a mid, instead of just here's one pixel, there's the next, let's figure out where to go. It'll actually maybe track it in between those pictures instead of just rounding up or rounding down to the point. So it allows it to be a little bit more precise. And then finally down here, we want it to adapt the feature. So as we get in on this window, we want it to, from one frame to the next frame, actually be like, okay, the next one I know the window now looks like this. Let's look for that. If you don't have that on, it's going to kind of keep looking for what was at the beginning. But we're going to go frame by frame because I only have 120 of these things and I don't think it's that hard to go through, but this is going to take me forever. But you know, it's worth it. On this one, I think it's worth it going frame by frame. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to track within this bounding box. Okay, let's go to the next frame. Now what you'll notice is that it's completely off. So I'm gonna have to drag this down, put that little marker in the upper right-hand corner. Okay, let's go to the next frame. Well, picked the wrong window. Pretty close. We're gonna go to the next one. Pick the next one. Oh my gosh, you can tell this is all over the place. So right now I'm just trying to get it to track the darn window. I'm gonna pause it right here. I'm just gonna show you what's gonna happen here. We're gonna make sure it's set to stabilize and we're gonna apply this sucker. Now you can choose here to apply it only to X, only to Y, or X and Y, and we're gonna put it on X and Y. You see that? So now it's tracking just that one barn window. Isn't that fantastic? So now you can see there's a lot of flicker going on. It's working. It's doing what we wanted it to do. It's locking that barn in place. Now let me just run through the whole thing so you can see what happens. There we go. We tracked everything now. Now very easily you can track that to a null object, and I do that all the time. You just go up to new, null object. This is a very simple technique. You take the pick whip, track it onto the null object, and now you can move this null object around, and whatever you do to the null object, you're going to do to the other one. So I like to say, let's scale this sucker up and let's make the position up a little bit. There we go. Now it's actually fitting within the frame, but you can see what we still have is this huge flicker problem. Now there's a couple things that we can do from here. We can add another tracker and we can add some deflicker. Let me just show you how you might add the other tracker. So you can go down here to your piece and we can go to track motion. This time, tracker number 2. Okay, so now we're tracking just this one point. So we can track that point, for instance. Let's just take the window. That could be our first tracker. And then the second tracker, because we want to add rotation, maybe we're tracking this window over here. Something like that. Maybe we put it up into the upper right-hand corner. We're trying to track that. Let's search for that. And we can go frame at a time. So then if you had the time, you would go through all of these. That's more or less what you would do when you add the second tracker. Now that second tracker, if you're doing 2 points, could do the scale and the rotation. I just clicked rotation, but you could also do scale. That way you know it's like widening out at the same rate as you're zooming in, stuff like that. I want to speed up. I want to talk about the next thing, which is how you would add a little bit of deflicker. Now the deflickering is really cool. It's a plugin actually from Revision. It's called deflicker. This is right here, deflicker timelapse. So I'm just going to drag it on and show you how it works. Now what's really great about this software is it's going to start figuring out what the color balance is between shots. What is the shadows? What are they doing? Let's try to level things out in between each frame. And that's exactly what you can see is happening here. Slowly, some of the frames look a little funky because of the way it's doing the deflicker, but when you speed it up, just look at that. So this is now with the deflicker switched on, and I've done almost nothing to this. I haven't adjusted any settings or anything yet. We'll get into that in a future tutorial just on the deflicker. But look at that. Right away, you can see myself zooming in now on that barn, and it's gonna look fantastic when we're done with the whole thing. In fact, it's gonna look like this. Okay, so there you have it. That, in a nutshell, is how you might take something like this, where you're taking a drone up and every single day taking another shot, zooming and pushing in on something. I hope what you took away from this is that 1, you can deflicker things. 2, you can actually use motion tracking to make this whole thing steady and stable. And 3, you might have taken away some ideas of how you might go about doing one of these yourself. In particular, pick that point of interest and put it right in the middle of your frame probably and do one simple move. That would be my recommendation. I just want to say a big shout out to George. Thank you for sending me this time lapse. I know that when you sent it in, you probably thought there was nothing we could do, and I kind of did too. I was like, there's nothing we can do here. But in the end, we figured it out. Pretty simple. Motion tracking, deflickering, easy peasy. We made this thing look good. Or at least as good as we could given the light conditions that it was shot in. All right, thanks everybody for watching. A big shout out to our patrons who make this stuff possible. Links to that below. And we will see you all next Tuesday.